Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our series of Denton's Brexit and Beyond webinars. My name is Michael Dean. I'm a partner in our competition and regulatory practice in the UK, currently webcasting from one of Denton's offices in Scotland. But joining me on the line are a number of colleagues, two from the UK, Jessica Pattinson, who's the head of our UK immigration practice, and Christopher McGee-Osborne, who's co-head of our UK government practice. I also have three colleagues from outside of the UK to share their perspective. Jeff Glees, a former US ambassador to Australia and a partner in our US public policy and regulation practice. And Nadia Nichai, a partner in our Brussels office who specialises in trade and regulatory matters, including WTO disputes. And finally, John Dick, who's a partner in our Singapore office and leads our Southeast Asia energy practice. So in these webinars, we look first at the latest developments in the unfolding Brexit process, and then at what some of the likely outcomes might mean for businesses. So we'll have about an hour for today's session, and as you know, there's the possibility of asking questions. So we'll begin with a very brief reminder about why so much about Brexit is uncertain. Even today, just 10 days before we're scheduled to leave the European Union. But then again, a week is a long time in politics, but I'm not sure that's going to be enough. So after that brief reminder, we'll look to the future and the sort of trade relationship we might end up with from the UK, and of course what that might mean for business. Further, what can we expect from trade negotiations that the UK will have to try to conclude with the EU and with other countries? And how will the UK's Brexit move play in the world where the rules-based international order is already arguably under stress, greater than it has for several decades? So please do ask questions and we'll try to get to them. So where are we and how did we get here? So a very brief recap. In 2016, a defined electorate in the UK took part in a referendum and voted by a small majority, 51.9 to 48.1, to leave the EU. March 2017, with parliamentary approval, UK government gives formal notice of its intention to leave the EU. Under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union, the UK and the European Union then had 2 years from giving the Article 50 notice, and that's until 29th March 2019, to agree the terms of the UK's withdrawal and an outline of the future relationship. And if no withdrawal agreement, then we simply cease to be part of the EU system. And that's how it operates. So after 18 months of negotiations, in November 2018, a draft withdrawal agreement and a political declaration of future relations emerged, and together they constitute the deal that the EU is offering the UK. Under this withdrawal agreement, the UK would leave the EU on 29th March this year, but be treated for most purposes as if it were still in the EU until the end of 2020, or if extended further, 2022. So during that transition or implementation period, the EU and the UK would negotiate the terms of the future relationship based on fairly broad outlines contained in the political declaration published in November. So that would give business and people time to adjust to whatever the future arrangement would be. So the UK Parliament and the European Parliament must approve this withdrawal deal before the Article 50 notice period expires, or the UK leaves the EU system and the EU with no deal and no terms agreed. So despite the Prime Minister agreeing to the deal, the UK Parliament voted overwhelmingly to reject it in January, and again did so last week. Parliament also voted to avoid a no-deal Brexit last week and to require the government to request the EU for an extension of the Article 50 notice period, since it's now generally accepted that the UK is not and will not be fully prepared for Brexit in legislative terms by the 29th of March. So the government had previously indicated a desire to seek another vote, a third vote, on this deal, which had been rejected twice, But only if there was reason to believe that it would possibly win that vote. Some, but not all of those who had voted against the deal, at least in the government benches, had started to indicate that they might be persuaded to change their minds on this. So Mrs May fully expected to bring the deal back a third time and had been corralling MPs in that respect. So 18th of March, just yesterday, the Speaker of the House of Commons, who has wide powers to control what's debated, voted on Parliament, ruled the government could not put substantially the same question before Parliament for its approval again. So it remains to be seen how the government will deal with the Speaker's ruling. There's a council meeting, European Council meeting next week, and we have 10 days to go before we leave the EU. So 21st March, the EU member states will meet to decide how to respond, and the UK will be requesting an extension of the Article 50 period. The government had said that if Parliament did back the deal, only a short extension would be required. But if Parliament did not back it, an extension of a year or more may be required. So matters are complicated by, further, the upcoming European parliamentary elections in late May. And the European Union is likely to insist that any short extension to the Article 50 period would end before the new European Parliament was elected, or at least before it meets. So EU leaders have said if they're going to give the UK more time, they'd like to have some assurance that it will result in a clear outcome before the new deadline, whatever deadline that is, expires. And that means they'll want either UK parliamentary approval for the current deal or a shift in UK policy. So with 10 days to go, it isn't quite clear that the UK will avoid leaving without sensible and predictable terms. So, Christopher, would you mind briefly outlining why has Parliament rejected this deal, what are the problems with it, and what we should be thinking about?
Thank you, Michael. Yes. Well, how and why have we got to where we've got to? I think stepping back from the process a bit, I think the reason that we're in the position we're in is that the UK is completely split on whether or not the UK wants to leave the European Union. The majority of MPs supported remaining in the European Union in the referendum in 2016, so the majority of them in their hearts don't really want to leave. That gives rise to a position where any deal about the departure would not have the support of those that supported leaving the European Union, and any deal that involves leaving the European Union would not have the support of those who want to remain. So in essence, that's the reason we've got to where we've got to. What had been going on was that Theresa May had been accused, in my view rightly, of running down the clock, in essence, not bringing forward any alternatives than the deal that she's negotiated. And remember, the deal that's been negotiated is only the withdrawal deal. It's the divorce. It's not the long-term trade arrangement between the UK and the EU. She'd essentially been bringing forward no alternative and hoping that those that refuse to support the deal because they think there's a better way of exiting would change their minds, because the alternative might be that there would be no exit at all. So the possibilities of what might happen next, very briefly, are, first of all, the government could, if they believe they could persuade Parliament to do so, they could challenge the Speaker's decision that the same motion can't be brought again without a substantial change in the underlying deal, because the will of Parliament trumps the Speaker, and therefore if the government felt that it had a majority in support of the deal, and there's no evidence at the moment that it would, it could simply refuse to accept the Speaker's decision, bring forward a motion to set aside that 1604 precedent that's been cited, and move on to seek the approval of Parliament for the deal. That's still a possibility. The second possibility is that Theresa May goes to the council meeting, finds some change that she's able to negotiate with the member states, and brings back a modified deal which would allow the Speaker to change his decision and potentially secure a positive vote. So those are the two immediate possibilities. Other possibilities are that the UK seeks a longer term. By the way, that any deal now would require an extension because there simply isn't parliamentary time to get through the legislation that's needed to implement exit in an orderly way. Of course, the 27 remaining EU member states don't have to agree that. I think that the next possibility is that the UK seeks a longer term extension, and the EU has signalled that it might well be minded to grant such an extension. And that could be used for any number of purposes. It could be used to support a renegotiation of the deal, something that the EU has said it's not minded to engage in. It could be used for a second referendum, which is something that a lot of people in the UK support, but there's no consensus in favour of that. It could also be used to make space for a general election. And I think if the UK were to go to the 27 member states and say, we're going back to the people either for a general election or for a referendum, it would be very hard for the EU not to grant sufficient time for that, because that obviously democracy trumps all. The other possibility is that you could find that there's a motion of no confidence in the government that effectively sees the government fall, and in that case, either there could be a no government decision of Parliament as to what should happen, or there would be a general election. So those are the sort of political permutations.
Yeah, but there's a legal point, is there not, that it is in the Withdrawal Act that we leave on the 29th of March, and that has to be dealt with as well.
It does. And in order for, so the law currently is that we leave at midnight on the 29th of March, unless the law is changed. That does not require a full act of Parliament. It requires a statutory instrument which can be brought forward with or without a debate, but it doesn't need the same level of debate and duration of debate that a full bill would. But again, it's not completely clear that there would be a majority in favour of changing the law. I think, though, given that that MPs have already voted in a resounding fashion for there being a no deal exit, then it's quite likely that would obtain support. However, what's less clear is what would lead to the support. I think if there were to be a suggestion of only a short-term extension, there will be some MPs who would oppose that. If there were to be a longer-term extension requested, then there may be some MPs that would oppose that. So again, it's not completely clear that we aren't still at risk of a no-deal exit by accident.
Yeah. I mean, I think on that, I just wanted to bring in Nadia with your knowledge of WTO rules and trade. Obviously, so we're talking about possibly the UK, and you hear people saying, well, that's the legal position that we leave on no deal. And obviously many things can happen to avoid that, but it's still a possibility. But what does that mean in practice, Nadia? Is there any greater clarity that's emerged about how trade is going to operate, and what it actually means, what it might mean for business, which is trading at the moment internationally and with the EU?
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. Interestingly, I think there has always been clarity about what, in theory, hard Brexit means for the UK and the EU's trade relationship. In theory, it means that WTO law will govern EU's trade with the UK and vice versa. But in practical terms and in reality, what this means is very blurry and challenging, both for the EU and for the UK. So in essence, we'll see effectively three types of immediate consequences, and I'll decipher each one of them in turn. First, EU-UK trade will be based on the MFN tariff rates. This means most favored nation tariff rates that would be applied by the European Union vis-à-vis goods originating in the United Kingdom, and the tariff that would be applicable on the goods exported from the European Union into the UK will also be subject to an MFN tariff rate. Second consequence is the trade will be subject to non-preferential rules of origin, and I'll explain in a second what that means. And finally, the two will couple and result in a very cumbersome import-export procedure and border controls and requirements that would apply to cross-border movement of goods, but also services. So let me take a step back and explain exactly how the WTO operates. In essence, UK's trade with the rest of the world now follows the WTO scenario, the WTO rules. The same scenario will have to be applied to the EU, but there are many difficulties why, and the reasons why this scenario applied to the rest of the EU will be problematic for the UK and for the EU. One of the most important foundations in the WTO is that to benefit from this reduced level of tariffs that countries have negotiated over years of trade rounds in the WTO, a country has to qualify for the MFN tariff. And to qualify for this reduced MFN, most favored nation treatment tariff, one has to declare and be of a certain origin. So to demonstrate that you can benefit from this tariff, your good has to carry a specific origin. And that's why the key instrument to establishing the origin and national origin of a product is the criteria and rules that determine the preferential rules of origin or non-preferential rules of origin. Rules of origin essentially are the set of criteria used to establish where the product is made, and as a result, what tariff, what duty would be applicable to its imports into a certain third country. The EU and the UK have for years been using the principle that as long as 50+% is made within the EU of a given product, so components, raw materials come from any one of the EU member states, that product would be considered of an EU origin. Following the hard Brexit, what will happen is that these 50% will effectively have to be, 50+% will have to be split into two separate corridors. So the UK origin will have to be 50+% for a good to be considered to be made in the UK. It will need to be made exclusively with the raw materials and all the transformations and added value that it may happen in the UK for 50+% in the UK. Then the good will be considered as it's been made in the UK. Same for the EU. EU now, rules of origin will be following a separate channel where only 27 member states inputs, raw materials, would make up a product that would be originating in the EU. Once you get to that, you realize that there will be a lot of difficulties for many of the high value added UK products to be considered as made in the UK. One readily available example is in the context of car manufacturing industry, where a lot of components are for the car manufacturing that happens in the UK are supplied from the EU. So that could impact how the products will be treated for the purposes of cross-border trade between the EU and the UK. Secondly, another thing to consider is that there are, aside from goods and services, there is still ambiguity about how the tariffs will be applied. Generally, there is a common understanding that EU's tariff rates are low on average, and they are. There is currently a 1.5% tariff rate on most of the goods overall applied for imports into the EU. So generally imports of UK goods should normally be benefiting from a fairly low tariff that will be applied upon importation of these goods into the EU. But you have to take into account that sectorally, the tariffs are a lot higher. So if you look at the same car manufacturing industry, the tariff rate 10%. So imports of cars from the UK into the EU will be subject to a 10% increase to their price value. That means that the cost for the manufacturer to supply and distribute these cars in the EU will be higher. That also in turn translates into these cars perhaps or potentially be less competitive than some of the European manufactured cars in the EU, because they will be competing with cars that will not be subject to any additional such tariff.
And that's tariffs, of course, and I suppose, and that's, well, it's not entirely clear, but it's relatively clear, I suppose, but non-tariff barriers presumably as well. How does the WTO rules, are they going to help us at all?
Yeah, no, we'll get to the non-tariff barriers in a second, but to answer your question, it will be very complicated because one thing that will disappear is mutual recognition and agreement on the quality and standards of products. So one thing that you would expect first and foremost is that there'll be border checks and controls at the crossing of border into the EU. There'll be no clarity about whether a given product that has been manufactured in the UK would be recognized as being equivalent or conforming to the requirements of safety in the EU. Effectively, in terms of practical consequences, what that means is the UK businesses will need to have two separate lines of manufacturing, one for the EU to produce goods that will be following the European standards, and second line for goods to be produced according to the UK standard for a given product.
Of course, at the moment we know that if we dispute a non-tariff barrier, we can do so in court. You can actually go to court and face down a government's move on a standard. In fact, there's a whole series of as it were, a clearing arrangement for national standards, which could be infringing trade. But if we're relying on WTO, what's the dispute mechanism, and how is it working at the moment? Just very briefly, Nadia.
Well, of course, the WTO has a mechanism for dispute resolution between the members. So any one member, including the UK, after Brexit, will be able to bring a case to the WTO against the European Union or any other member, worried to feel that any one of the agreements to which both parties both the EU and UK are subject and have undertaken commitments, are violated. Set of these agreements govern phytosanitary measures and technical measures, technical barriers to trade. So these are the so-called non-tariff barriers agreements. And okay. So, in essence, the recourse will be to bring a case to the WTO and say that for one reason or another, the non-tariff barriers applied by the EU are in excess of those that would be justifiable under the regulatory measure that is being pursued or regulatory objective. And if UK were successful in demonstrating that these measures are really obscure and non-transparent and discriminatory, you would then be able to get EU to withdraw some of these regulations.
Okay, I know that obviously the UK has been looking for replacement deals, and several have been agreed so far, and we'll maybe come back to that because I know that Christopher's got a meeting tomorrow that might shed some light on this. We'll come back to that. Christopher, remind me about that. But I was just wondering, obviously we've looked at the, if you like, no deal tariff issues, non-tariff issues, and obviously there's a lot of complexity around that. Businesses are also, people are important. I was just going to turn to Jessica on the immigration position. I understand you might have been speaking to one or two businesses of late about labour issues. Jessica, can you tell us how are we set up for, obviously there's the deal provisions, and then there's what happens if we have a no deal for employees and movement of labour.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Michael. So immigration is one area where we have had some notice and clarity in terms of deal and no deal. The EU nationals already resident in the UK, deal and no deal, will look and feel very much the same. EU nationals will be able to stay in the UK subject to applying for new residence documentation under a scheme called the EU Settlement Scheme. But for businesses looking to recruit from the EU post-Brexit in a no-deal scenario, while there will be transitional arrangements in place, it remains to be seen whether these transitional arrangements will be sufficiently attractive to EU nationals. Essentially, EU nationals will be able to apply for a one-time 3-year visa to live and work in the UK. But when you compare that 3-year visa to freedom of movement across 27 EU member states, it will be very difficult for some business to entice those EU nationals to come to the UK. But I think the more pressing issue at the moment, and the one that I'm hearing the most on from clients, is actually how UK nationals will be able to work in Europe in a no-deal scenario. A lot of businesses have been designed on the basis of UK nationals being able to work freely across the EU 27, and in a no-deal scenario, that freedom of movement will of course end. There are a lot of businesses that require UK nationals, for instance, to work in Europe for 3 days a week, for 6 months at a time for particular projects or for particular business or client needs. And in that situation, these UK nationals are going to require work permits, which will, necessitate significant changes to established practices. And with not very much notice on how UK nationals will continue to be able to work in Europe, it will be very difficult for business to respond and get these permits in place.
Sorry, Jessica, are those permits is that each nation will have their own position on that? Is that an EU issue?
A bit of both. There are EU directives that have been implemented in most countries around the EU. Immigration is one area where EU member states can opt out of EU directives. So the UK, for instance, has always opted out of EU directives on immigration policy, the same with Ireland and Denmark, but really across the other EU member states, there is some harmonisation of qualifying criteria. So if you will find that the qualifying criteria in Germany is much the same as for Italy and for Poland. There is also a mechanism for something that resembles free movement between participating member states. And that's something that I'm certainly getting a lot of questions on. How can a UK national living in the Netherlands go and work in Poland for 2 months on a particular project without having to apply for a new permit? But it is very complicated. It's something that UK businesses haven't really had to deal with up until now. And certainly with only 10 days to go to a possible no-deal Brexit, there's no time to prepare. It will simply be a matter of responding if we do end up in a no-deal scenario in 10 days.
Okay, I think my blood pressure is going up a little bit just with that. So I was wondering if we could maybe change tack a little bit to maybe looking at the international picture and maybe the future for the UK. And I was going to turn to Jeff. You were formerly the US ambassador to Australia, but I believe your life is much more exciting now as a partner in Denton's, the US regulation. Obviously.
The glamour.
And much more glamorous. So there has been a suggestion. Obviously, politicians have come out with a lot of statements, not all of them necessarily hugely factually based, but is their view on various issues. And one of the issues that's spoken about is that it should be relatively easy for the UK, which of course is a leading economy in the world order, to reach trade agreements, and obviously what the UK is wanting at the moment is in the short term anyway, for the European Union trade agreements to be rolled over by various third countries, which and adjustments to be made as appropriate in due course. But one of the drivers that is cited for the benefits and opportunities of Brexit is trade deals with third countries, in particular the United States, the leading economy. So I'm just wondering your own view of a trade deal with the US. It gets the UK media tends to focus obviously on usually fundamental issues, and actually I wouldn't say these are not unimportant, but chlorinated chicken, which are food standards obviously, and issues of investment, particularly in the National Health Service, and whether that would end up being privatised. These are the sort of things that are talked about. But how do you see realistically a UK-US trade agreement?
Well, I'm not overly optimistic about any US-UK trade agreement being negotiated in the near term. In part because you have an administration that is somewhat conflicted about trade generally. They've already gone back and tried to renegotiate some existing trade agreements, abandoned others. So, for example, the NAFTA trade agreement, not dramatic changes in it, but it took a long time to accomplish a little bit. Abandoned TPP altogether, and now wondering, whether there's some way back in. Since everyone else moved forward with it, that's a Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trying to negotiate a set of trade arrangements with China, and I think people have been following that as well. The notion that the relatively light staff of the U.S. Trade Representative is going to be able to manage all that in a administration which has expressed skepticism about the value to Americans of trade deals, and the slowdown in TTIP and everything else. I'm just, if this is the hope of people in the UK that the US is going to rapidly come up with a viable trade deal that others can emulate, I'm not optimistic about it.
And I suppose, I mean, trade deals are spoken. It's like motherhood and apple pie and trade deals, but actually each of them have their own downsides, I suppose. But as if it's always going to be, and obviously any deal, if it's going to be concluded, should be a win-win deal. But you might have sectors that lose out, presumably, and what are the sectors that should be concerned the UK if you're going to do a deal with the US?
Well, I think the U.S. is going to be most concerned about its export market to the U.K. It's in particular farming and manufacturing. The U.S. has been particularly hard hit by Brexit, in part because of concerns about losing easy access to one of its most important markets for agricultural exports and likewise for manufacturing. Manufacturing is hurt mostly because the weak pound makes it much more expensive to export generally. So I think the key point of the U.S. in a trade deal would be focusing on protecting our agricultural exports and our ability to keep shipping manufacturing materials there. Probably, if we were being forward-thinking, which I'm not, absolutely confident about, but if we were, we'd want to have a number of the, IP-related elements in our trade deal that we had in TTIP and the TPP, but I think would be secondary to these sort of meat and potatoes, literally, issues.
Yeah, and I suppose financial services as well must be certainly it's a sector to both the US and obviously the UK. It's hugely important.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the US is doing, businesses are operating with the assumption that they need to take some matters into their own hands. Many of them are setting up subsidiaries in the EU where they, currently have headquarters in the UK as sort of a backstop. In other cases, companies that are deciding where to set up their headquarters are just setting it up in the UK in order to reduce uncertainty and, contingencies. I think the main thing that I've been telling U.S. companies is, if you're trying to anticipate what the U.S. government is going to do, good luck. I think what you need to start doing is just look at the situation as it is and begin, heat mapping the areas of risk to understand, how the disruption is going to impact your particular area. Start identifying point people within your organization to develop contingency plans, and do likewise with your suppliers and customers and key organizations, in the UK and EU, and then focus on some of the things that have already been discussed. Really, thinking about supply chain with customs checks, thinking about your business travelers and work permissions. Planning for potential delayed payments, and making sure you're not, have a capital exposure, but really much more, taking matters into your own hands as opposed to relying upon a trade deal to sort this out in the short term.
But I was going to go to Jeff to talk about the ASEAN position. Thank you there, Jeff. I was going to go to John. And I was just reminded as you were speaking there, we'll come back to what we think the positives and opportunities possibly for businesses and clients. And there will be opportunities for some, of course, there always is, where there's major change. But I'm reminded with Paul Lalonde, who's on Wednesday's webinar, our Canadian partner, used the term grim fascination when he was talking about how North Americans were looking at what was going on in the UK. I like that term, grim fascination. But John, in terms of ASEAN and clients, what are they concerned about at the moment? And then we'll maybe go on from there and talk about some of the arrangements that might be put in place. Just briefly, what's the picture from the ASEAN?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation in ASEAN. Talking to a couple of clients recently, they've looked at their operations in the UK and they've gone, because they're very UK focused, it won't have much of an impact. And then you start to talk to them about the supply chain issues around their businesses, and they suddenly dawns on them that, actually, even though they thought they were just investing in the UK, they've really got European issues that will come across their businesses. So I think that despite all the news, the sort of it's almost like the old Y2K issue. You're not sure exactly what the impact is until the clock passes midnight. And for a number of businesses in this part of the world, I think what the last few weeks in particular and the concern about a no-deal Brexit has brought everything into sharp focus for them about what the potential impact is, whether it is a no-deal Brexit or whether even if there is the rollover for a couple of years, again, will we get to the point in a couple of years' time where everything's happening at the last minute and we then have the same sort of issues having to be addressed. And I think there are a number of countries in Southeast Asia where the UK is a major trading partner. I think the announcement about tariffs has been a positive one from the UK point of view, because there was concern about tariffs going into the UK for goods and quotas as well, because obviously there are significant advantages for ASEAN countries under the European ASEAN arrangements. And I think that's an issue. I think rules of origin, again, are going to come into play if in the early stages, if the UK cannot maintain the EU rule of origin, EU origin, then that sort of throws some markets into disarray out in this part of the world. On the trade deal front, I think there's an expectation from the UK point of view that, oh yes, trade deals will, because we've got some major trading partners out here, trade deals will come through easily, and I think they will be sadly mistaken. I don't know that it's because countries won't want to do a deal, but I think it's just that any trade deal takes time, and particularly if the UK was to try and replicate the EU ASEAN trade deal. ASEAN takes a long time to agree amongst itself. It's a mini EU in itself, and that will take time. So we could be left in a position where there is a gap, even with best intent.
And obviously,
I'm sorry, this is Jeff. I just wanted to add to that point, which is that's what the U.S. did with the U.K. We just replicated the trade rules that we have with the EU, but it'll, in terms of having free trade deal and all the elements that the U.S. is generally looking for in free trade. As I said, I think that's a long time to develop, and so we're basically going to be stuck in a holding pattern with this what was supposed to be an interim agreement, I think, being sort of the permanent agreement for quite a while.
And I suppose if you're going to be doing a trade deal with the UK, you need to understand, and again, I wouldn't say I was an expert in this area, but you need to understand what's your agricultural subsidy type regime, what are your various other regimes that are going to have an impact on that third country you're going to do a deal with, and indeed, I suppose, what's your relationship going to be with that significant market of 450 million right next door, i.e. the European Union or European Economic Area. So I suppose, is there a degree of you need to get your ducks in a row on this, whether the ducks are chlorinated or not? You've got to get your ducks in a row in order so that third countries can really understand the type of environment they're going to be dealing with.
I'm sorry, who was that directed to?
Well, I mean, just to Nadia, to Jeff, to John. Is that part of the picture in terms of do third countries need to understand, what is the regime in the UK in various sectors before they can actually understand how to do a deal with them? Because obviously, some of the regimes in the UK will be changing, particularly agricultural subsidy to a degree.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think from the U.S. Said that they are going to look into further negotiations after they see what happens with Brexit, because it completely affects the negotiating posture of the U.S. And so at least we had a target before with the Theresa May deal. The president expressed pleasure with it, but at least you can't putt till the hole stops moving, and that's the problem now.
It's Christopher here. It's probably also worth noting that the UK has announced what its tariff policy would be if there's a no deal exit, and it's taken with some limited exceptions, including some agricultural products, it's taken a very low tariff stance, and I think that the feeling is that's partly aimed to stimulate potential trade negotiations outside the EU, but also to put a stake in the ground as to what the long-term trade relationship might look like with the EU.
But if I can jump in on this issue, because agriculture is a unique sector in and of itself, because it's not only subject to tariffs, it's also subject to quotas. So we had a situation where Europe-wide there were quotas, including quotas for the UK, and the whole of the EU in terms of amount of goods that could be agricultural goods that could be imported into the EU. Now this will need to change, because with hard Brexit, UK will no longer be part of the EU-wide quotas. It will have to then respond to the WTO members, who will be asking UK to renegotiate with them the terms of access to the UK market. And unfortunately, the UK will find itself in a weaker position because the market will be narrower. UK has in the WTO already tried to say, look, we will give us the same terms as you did to the EU, to the third countries. In negotiating with the third countries, they said we would like to have the same terms as the EU, but the third countries in the WTO have come back to the UK saying, no, wait a second, let's renegotiate. And it's part of the general agreement on tariffs and trade that when a member seeks to modify certain terms of their schedules or access to the market conditions, they have to give concessions to the third countries in response, because they will be taking a hit and suffering from the modification of these schedules. So think about quotas. This is not the end of the story. UK will need to embark on a massive negotiations with the WTO members who will be asking it to negotiate with them about the terms of access to the agricultural market in the UK. And what often happens is that in the market in which we negotiate is not the market to which the concessions are restricted. So the UK may be finding itself in a position where it would need to give concessions in other sectors and other markets to compensate for certain loss incurred by UK's trading partners with respect to the hard Brexit. So this is one area to watch, and one where it's not clear how well the UK is prepared to handle this. And on this matter, I agree with you, Michael. UK will need to figure out what its economic power is in the agricultural market as it currently is, in order to be able to negotiate with the rest of the world the terms of access to the market. So I would imagine there would be a wave of protectionism at the beginning, because UK will need to try and protect its vulnerable agricultural sector before it can give unrestricted access to the rest of the world, to this market, and allow flow of goods into the agricultural industry of the UK.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think I was wanting to sort of bring us back to, we said we're going to talk about the possible future relationship that the UK might have with the European Union, the trading relationship. And obviously, lots of the focus has been on this negotiation of the terms of withdrawal. And this is what we're stumbling over at the moment. And there's this political declaration. And there's been a lot of speculation that actually what the UK could and should be negotiating with the European Union is a Canada-style agreement. And I'm just wondering if those on the line would like to talk a little bit about, will a Canada-style arrangement be enough? And of course, one of the things we've got to think about, I suppose, in the future relationship is the little issue of a backstop and the Irish border issue, because that, I think, will still remain an issue depending on what the future trading relationship is. And of course, some people have argued that that's what we really needed to discuss over the last 2 years was a future relationship in order to avoid that problem. But the Canadian agreement, which has recently been concluded, I mean, I welcome comments on how easy do you think it should be for the UK to conclude a Canadian-style agreement with the EU? And will it be enough? And what will the difference be for business if that's the route we go down?
Hi, it's Christopher. I think one of the things that it distinguishes the UK trading relationship with the EU, which is quite different from its trading relationship with Canada, is the extent to which services are traded EU-wide. So the EU has an economy that's, if not dominated by services, that has a very large services sector. And one of the issues for the UK is going to be that international trade deals very rarely deal with services in a way that's likely to be satisfactory for the UK in relation to its trading arrangements with the EU 27. And therefore, I think that's a reason why no existing trade deal really gets to the heart of what the UK is going to need, although there are lots of useful precedents about.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I noticed there are no questions so far from those listening, but so obviously we've made everything very clear. So services would be an issue, and would that? I suppose it's speculations whether the Canada-style arrangement with the EU, even if it was Canada Plus, which included to a degree a services chapter with the EU, whether that would be sufficient to solve the Irish border issue. I suppose that's just speculation.
I mean, the issue with the Irish border is how can you have a border at which standards of goods moving in either direction across the border are checked and tariffs are collected without some sort of physical border mechanism, and that's the conundrum. Whether if there is a sufficient time both to develop a technological solution and to negotiate a longer-term trade deal, whether more time will prove that solutions can be developed isn't really clear. But that's the essence of the conundrum. You're in a situation where the current state of the law in the EU is that there will need to be a physical border, but nobody really wants it. And of course, we have the men with guns sitting there, somewhat older than they were, but we've had recent reminders that they're still capable of doing things because we've had incendiary devices delivered within mainland Britain.
Yeah. I said earlier on that we would look at some of the opportunities. Those on the line, have you seen clients making a move to take advantage of aspects of Brexit? Obviously, I think we understand that certain member states and economic development bodies across member states are taking advantage of it. Have you seen anything?
Well, this is Jeff. Yeah, I think the Netherlands in particular has done a very effective marketing job convincing Americans that they need to set up their businesses, either their central operations or a backup operation in Holland. And they're certainly taking advantage of it and doing it effectively. I've had 3 different clients in the past probably 5 months choose to set up operations in Holland.
And anyone else, these sort of UK businesses being able to take advantage of anything particular? I suppose supply chains might be coming home to a degree.
Michael, we are starting to see some capital recognizing that the UK is at a historic low in terms of the cost of investing right now. So you've got 2 things that have happened as a direct consequence of the referendum result. You have a pound that's devalued, and you also have a fall in real estate prices. And the combination of those 2 things are creating opportunities that some money is starting to follow.
Yeah.
Christopher, I'd make a comment on that. I was going to say that in the last couple of weeks, I don't think I've seen as many UK property developers advertising properties in Singapore, properties in the UK, but advertising them in Singapore. And one of their leads is because of Brexit and the property market, the prices are down. Now's a great time to invest in the UK.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question. This is Jeff. I thought you were asking about other countries. Yeah, no, we're seeing the same thing in the U.S. That is the argument that you buy low and it get much worse than this. Things will improve.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We still have no difficult questions, so unless there's anything that those on the line of the speakers today feel they would just like to add as to any further thoughts.
I guess just at a very practical level, for those clients and contacts who are listening to this, there's an awful lot that we can do to help businesses to assess their risk in relation to a no-deal Brexit or a longer-term risk assessment. I think businesses will have been looking at this for some time, but things are changing so quickly and the environment's so dynamic that don't be shy to come and talk to us, and it doesn't necessarily cost the earth to get some quick advice from us.
Yeah, in fact, we had an example of my team where, to avoid tariffs and also possible logistical issues at borders, two companies effectively swapping sources of supply, which had some competition law considerations in it, but for a period of time, that's their insurance policy to get around the problem. And these are sort of, I think, imaginative moves that could possibly, avoid some disruption in the short to medium term. But yeah, absolutely. So it just remains for me to thank everybody who has been with us on the line. I hope you have found that interesting. And I'd also very much like to thank Christopher, Jessica, Jeff, Nadia, and John for their time and their insights. So feel free to contact us at Denton's should you have any further questions, or your usual contact at Denton's, or Damien Taylor, our Director of BD. His details are on the Brexit side. There are further sessions going to be held over the following weeks, and of course we'll be watching, as we all will, developments to see where we're going to end up, or at least what direction we're heading in. So thank you, the speakers, and thank you everybody for participating, and have a very good day.